Greetings, fellow Void Luggers. Today we're talking about Citrine. What can I say? She's such an amazing Warframe. To be honest, everything that I'm about to show you about her build in this video is not necessary, as she can perform really well with almost any build whatsoever. Her basic kit already gives you unlimited health and energy orbs, decent damage reduction, as well as red crits on any weapon. However, a few things may still be done to make her not only more effective for higher level content, but also even more fun to play. First of all, let's discuss her Archon Shard options, as those will stay the same in all of my builds. Citrine is one of the few frames that can get the most out of all types of shards. That's why she's kind of the Thanos of Warframe. The most important one here is definitely the purple mini equilibrium shard. You see, Citrine's one produces both a health orb and an energy orb. However, the chance of energy dropping is lower than that of health, and that's exactly what our shard helps us with. Keep in mind that if min-maxing is not your cup of tea, the original equilibrium mod or a regular purple shard will do just fine. The second most important shard here is probably the yellow one. It kinda saves our ass because if enemies have surrounded you while you're out of shields, you may die while recasting your 2. This shard also helps us spam our 1 really fast. Another thing that is worth explaining is the green shard. What it does is it enables you to apply 13 stacks of corrosion on enemies instead of 10, which basically allows us to strip armor almost completely. But if you simply love your enemies to have red health bars instead of yellow ones, you can install another green shard. Keep in mind that if that's what you want, the shards don't need to be Tau forged, as the maximum amount of corrosion stacks is 14. The other shards are basically flex slots, and to be honest, almost anything would be okay here. Originally, I had a strength red shard and a max energy blue shard. However, after playing and testing, I figured that the strength one didn't do as much and swapped it with a duration one instead for quality of life. And as for the energy one, I realized that just one blue energy shard is sometimes not enough for her spammer caster gameplay, so I went with Arcane Battery anyway, even though I tried to avoid it originally. That's why I ended up putting an armor shard into her. Anyway, as I've said, these are basically flex slots, so anything you like would work well enough here. If you don't want to use Arcane Battery, the best option would probably be to put 2 Tau forged energy blue shards.
So let's finally take a look at the builds that I ended up making for Citrine. Let's start with the first one that I called Visible. It's a kind of a universal build that can be used for almost any mission in the game. If we're dealing with defense or mobile defense, her augment may be swapped for something like more range, strength, or duration. However, the most important mod here is probably Adaptation. The rest are basically 9 flex slots. The reason why Adaptation is so important is because Citrine has no invincibility in her kit, just the damage reduction that her 2 gives her. However, her 2 only blocks 90% of the incoming damage, so she definitely needs another source of damage reduction against higher levels. With this build, Citrine has just over 99% damage reduction, which should be enough unless you want to casually fight level cap enemies. However, if that's what you want, the following 2 builds will fit that type of gameplay better. Let's talk a little bit more about this one though. So, as for this build's Helminth ability, I decided to keep all of her abilities intact. This means that we can use her original ult that lets us hit red crits with any weapons. Yes, even with the Kuva Nucor and something like the Kuva Com. As you may have figured already, weapons are quite important for this build, while our 3 and 4 will just support our damage output. What I like about this build is that it gives us a nice balance of damage and survivability, but keep in mind that it's not strong enough for level cap. Alright, moving on to the second build that I named Invisible. At first glance, it's very similar to the first one, however the gameplay is rather different. First of all, we will basically almost never use our weapons with it, because if we do, we'll lose our invisibility and with it, our buff from the Arcane Crepuscular. You may wonder, how exactly are we going to become invisible? Well, I'm glad you asked. Shade will help us with that. His build doesn't really matter as long as you have Ghost and Vacuum installed. Since Shade is not a cat, a dog, a moa, or a hound, it cannot use the prismatic companion augment. So the gem will not be able to follow us, and we will need to recast our 3 more frequently. One more thing that I gotta mention is that our Helminth ability for this build is, of course, Wisp's Breach Surge. It synergizes really well with Arcane Crepuscular because one produces sparks that are always critical, and the other boosts their critical multiplier. Here's some gameplay that demonstrates this synergy. As you can see, this build basically turns your Citrine into something like Octavia, since you're both invisible and damage a lot of enemies with abilities. Their difference, though, is that Octavia scales with enemy levels and Citrine doesn't. So this setup is probably less effective than Octavia on super high levels. So now I offer y'all to take a look at my third build. With it, Citrine is truly... Funnily enough, all mods here are identical to the first build. However, this time we have a different aura, and our Helminth of choice is Mirage's Eclipse. Together with Preserving Shell, Adaptation, and Health Conversion, our damage reduction reaches just over 99.9%, which is enough to survive almost anything in the game. If it's not enough, however, you can still use the shield gating mechanics due to Brief Respite. And if you think that even that's not enough for you, you can change one or both arcanes to something more defensive. For example, Arcane Aegis or Arcane Blessing. However, I still recommend using the Arcane Impetus on Citrine. Mainly not because of the strength buff, but because of the efficiency buff. Because her gameplay requires you to spam abilities all the time. By the way, I know that in my last video, the build for Corvex is far from being optimal. A remastered version of that build will come out eventually. But long story short, he needs even more range, and as for those Topaz shards, he just doesn't benefit much from them. So something like strength and armor or max energy works much more efficiently. And that will do it for today. Thanks for watching, and yes, I know how terrible my frame rate is. I am going to fix it as soon as I get a new PC. That will be around the same time we're going to get our hands on Araxia Prime. So stay tuned. Alright, bye.